We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and this is a book we found in the public domain, public access. We bring you this book via this video. No copyright infringement was intentional or intended. And this book is for educational purposes only. Archaeological writings of the Sanhedrin and Talmuds of the Jews, taken from the ancient parchment and scrolls at Constantinople and the Vatican at Rome, being the record made by the enemies of Jesus of Nazareth in his day. The most interesting history ever read by man, by Reverend W.D. Mahan of Boonsville, M.O., author of ʻtæl and Hebrew History of Baptism, who is extensively known to the ministry in the West. Published for the author by Perry Smith, Book and Job Printers, St. Louis, USA, 1884. Who is Reverend W.D. Mahan? William Dennis Mahan, born July 27, 1824, died October 19, 1906, was an American Cumberland Presbyterian minister in Boonville, Missouri, USA, and author of a book commonly known as the Archko volume. The Archko volume of Archko Library is a 19th century volume containing what purports to be a series of reports on Jewish and pagan sources contemporary with Jesus that relate to the biblical text describing his life. And the book went through a number of versions. Yes, we think if we heard of this author before. And that Archko volume, a forgery apparently, purported to be a translation of a Jewish, Roman and often contemporary documents about the trial and death of Jesus of Nazareth. The volume was initially received by some as true, but soon after its publication its authenticity was questioned. The book has been definitely discredited as a forgery and fraud. Life and career. William Dennis Mahan was born July 27, 1824 in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, USA. He was serving as a minister in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church by 1845. First forgery. In 1879, Mahan published a pamphlet of 32 pages entitled A Correct Transcript of Pilate's Court. It purported to be an official report of the trial and death of Jesus, made directly to the Roman Emperor Tiberius, emperor from AD 14 until 37. He's the only Caesar that said, no, I'm not going to deem myself divine or a god or a son of Jupiter, etc., for I am a human being like everybody else out there. The Senate said, you have to say you're a god, you're divine, born of the gods, etc. We decree it. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. Where every other emperor did. It's purported to be an official report of the trial and death of Jesus made directly to the Roman Emperor Tiberius by Pilate, who was the head procurator in those days, the fifth governor of the Roman province of Judea, serving under Emperor Tiberius from 26-27 to 36-37 AD. He is best known for being the official who presided over the trial of Jesus and ultimately ordered his crucifixion. So he was governor of Judea. Mahan claimed the text was supplied to him in 1856 by a German scholar, Henry C. Weidemann, from Father Peter Freelandhusen, the chief guardian of the Vatican, who sent the Latin text to Weidemann's brother-in-law, C.C. Vantberg of New York, for English translation. Yeah, apparently he said he went to the Vatican, something like he found it, and he didn't even go, never even made the trip. Weidemann, Freelandhusen and Vantberg are otherwise unknown, and documentation of the exchange contains inconsistencies and errors, including Freelandhusen's request for a fee payable of in darics, ancient Persian coins. This work was copied almost verbatim from Ponce Pilate a Vienna, a short story by Joseph Méry, published in Revue de Paris in 1837. Méry said that he had been inspired by an old Latin manuscript and in 1842 English translation of the story made the claim that it was in fact taken from an old Latin manuscript. Mahan's contribution was evidently to create correspondence, showing him to be the discoverer of the manuscript. Archco forgery. In 1884, Mahan published the first version of the Archco volume entitled The Archaeological Writings of the Sanhedrin and Talmuds of the Jews, taken from the ancient parchments and scrolls at Constantinople and the Vatican at Rome, being the record made by the enemies of Jesus of Nazareth in his day. The most interesting history ever read by man. This included an expanded version of Pilate's Court, plus a series of other texts that he claimed to have obtained himself in a visit to Rome and Constantinople, and translated with the aid of Dr. M. McIntosh of Scotland and Dr. Twyman of England, also otherwise unheard of. These texts include interviews with the shepherds, Gamaliel's interview with Joseph and Mary, Caiaphas' report to the Sanhedrin, Eli's story of the Magi, Herod Antipater's defense before the Senate for the massacre of the innocents, and Herod Antipas's defense before the Senate, all with the claim that they were copied from ancient manuscripts and translated into English. The texts are otherwise unknown to scholarship, and the volume contains various inconsistencies. It quotes an unknown Greek philosopher, Melisine, and includes references to Josephus that do not exist. It mistakenly asserts that Philo spoke often of Jesus and that the scribes of those days were mostly all rabbis. There are inaccurate descriptions of the library at the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The Hagia Sophia Grand Mosque is a mosque, a former church, and a major cultural and historical site in Istanbul, Turkey. The making of papyrus and an inaccurate chronology for both Philo and Tacitus. Contemporaries raise the question of whether Mahan could have possibly made the trip to Rome and Constantinople in less than 2 months. Most tellingly, large portions of Eli and the story of the Magi were copied verbatim from the 1880 novel Ben-Hur. At one point, a strange word reveals that a single line of the printed text of Ben-Hur was accidentally omitted during copying. Exposure as a fraud. Among the first to call Mahan's work into question was Reverend Dr. James A. Corliss of Lexington, Missouri. He was soon followed by William E. Curtis, a correspondent for the Chicago Record Herald in Rome. Curtis investigated Mahan's claims and declared the manuscript spurious and the alleged translation a forgery. Mahan denied all the charges against him and asserted the truth of what he had written. He was summoned before church authorities in September 1885 on charges of falsehood and plagiarism, and a church trial was held. The New Lebanon Presbytery, of which he was a member, tried the case at length. Evidence was introduced to show that Mahan had never been to Rome, but that he had spent the time he was absent from Boonville on a farm in Illinois. The editor of the Boonville Advertiser showed that the letters that paper had printed were postmarked from a small town in Illinois. Mahan rebutted the evidence by saying that they had been sent there to be remailed. Additional evidence that Mahan had not travelled to Rome included a letter from Father Eri, prefect of the Vatican Library. Eri stated that Mahan was entirely unknown there and that no person connected with the library had ever seen or heard of the Acta Pilati or any such manuscript. That's right, yeah, the book of the actual Pilate, that's right. Lew Wallace, author of Ben-Hur, an American envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary. The United States has maintained many high levels contacts with Turkey since the 19th century. To the Ottoman Empire, testified that no record of Mahan's visit to Turkey or to the library of the Hagia Sophia existed, and that the primary sources he cited were unknown. The verdict of the Presbytery was nearly unanimous. He was convicted and suspended from the ministry for 1 year. Following his suspension, Mahan made no effort to return to the pastorate, and there's heaps more information there. So it's basically a fraudster. Yeah. It's all false doctrine, a literary forgery. Well, we'll have a look at it anyway. Looks pretty interesting reading. Yeah. Archaeological writings of Sanhedrin Talmuds of the Jews, written by Reverend W.D. Mahan, said to be a fraudster. Contents. To the reader, believing that no event of as much importance as the death of Jesus of Nazareth was to the world could have transpired without some record being made of it by his enemies in their courts, legislations and histories. The author commenced investigating the subject. After many years of study and after consulting various histories and corresponding with many scholars, I secured the assistance of two learned men, Doctors McIntosh and Twyman, and went to the Vatican at Rome and then to the Jewish Talmuds at Constantinople, incurring a risk of my life as well as expending a good deal of money. As a result, I have compiled the following book, which will be found one of the most strange and interesting works ever read. It may appear fragmentary, but the reader will remember that it is a record of men made nearly 2,000 years ago. W. D. Mahan, Boonville, M.O., July 1st, 1884. Chapter 1, a short sketch of the Talmuds. The Hebrew word lamod signifies to teach, and to teach by example. This word example is always understood. To teach, this is what is meant by tradition. It means that the child learns from its father. From this word we get the word Talmud. We also have the word shano, which means to learn, and gamor, which means having learned or having ceased to learn. The Talmuds are written on parchment or papyrus. The scroll is about 20 inches wide and rolled around a windlass. From these Talmuds there have been many books written by the Jewish rabbis. The most important is the Mishnah. Its name indicates what it is, the law. It contains the laws of all nations, or a part of the laws of the various nations of the earth, such as the Jewish Sanhedrin thought were compatible with the laws of God. Its principal teachings are what we would call the moral law of God. That is to say, anything is right if God says it is right, and this is the only reason why it is right. This work has been a great reference book for the Jewish rabbis in all ages. It was translated and compiled by Hillel, and is a very useful book for good scholars. The next in point of value is the Tosefta. This word in the Hebrew means treatment, and contains mainly the ritual of the temple service. It is a very extensive work and is really a regulator of human life, having the dealings of husband and wife, parent and child, master and pupil in fact. It enters into all the details of life with such thoughtfulness and in such a beautiful style that it would be exceedingly interesting to the young. It certainly contains the finest system of morals in the world. Then comes the Mechirta, which means government in the Hebrew language. This book tells of the organization of the Sanhedrin and its power, both the greater and the lesser, the greater being composed of 70 and the lesser of 24. These two legislative bodies had control of the whole of the Jewish Commonwealth. Although they exercised great power, their power was not absolute. There was another court that held the highest authority of the nation. That was the court of elders and priests. This court consisted of 12 men, and its chairman was the high priest. It decided all appeals and could not be appealed from. This is the court that tried Jesus of Nazareth, and although it was a court of appeals, capital crimes were tried by no court but this. The author states, I will give the form of a trial of a criminal in this court as it is given in Mechilta. At the time that Jesus was tried by this court, the Jewish government had lost its executive power. This was one of the conceded points in the capitulation by Augustus Caesar. So at this time the Roman emperor's consent had to be obtained, though he had to use the Jewish soldiers, for the Romans had only 100 soldiers at Jerusalem. They were all the time engaged in war and needed all their soldiers at home. When a criminal was brought before this court of the high priests, they went through a preliminary trial in order, if possible, to bring him an acknowledgement. If they could not, he was sentenced and then sent to the Roman authority or governor for his approval. He was then sent back to the high priest and from there to the Sanhedrin, with the charges written out and the names of the witnesses by which these things had been proven. If they approved the decision of the high priest, the prisoner was sent back to the high priest for his final. This court of 12 men was required by the Jewish law to fast and pray one whole day before the trial commenced. Then they were required to bring the Urim and Thummim out of the holy place where they were kept and to place them before the high priest. He was closely veiled so that no one could see him, thus representing God doing his work. Then there was what was called the lactes, consisting of 2 men, one of whom stood at the door of the court with a red flag in his hand, and the other sat on a white horse some distance on the road that led to the place of execution. Each one of these men continually cried the name of the criminal, his crime, who were the witnesses, and called upon any person who knew anything in his favour to come forward and testify. After the testimony was taken, the 11th man The 11 men cast lots or voted, and their decision was shown to the high priest. As he too was too holy to act of himself, but only as the mouthpiece of God, he went up to a basin, or a ewer, as it is called by them, and washed his hands, in token of the innocency of the court, thus testifying that the criminal's own action had brought condemnation on himself. As soon as the soldiers saw this, they took the man to the place of execution, and there stoned him till he was dead. Not one of them was allowed to speak, not even to whisper, while the execution was going on. Nothing was heard but the pelting of stones and the shrieks of the criminal. To my mind, or the author's mind, this would be one of the most awful modes of death, and one that would be more likely to deter others from committing crime. Now, the author asks the reader to see the mode of a Roman execution, and see what a beautiful chain of divine providence is brought out in the execution of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a law in the criminal code of the Romans, enacted by Melisine, who was a Greek by birth and a philosopher by nature, that taught that if a man was accused of a crime and was tried and found guilty, he should be publicly chastised. His reasons were that the man had acted improperly, so much so that he had created suspicion. This would seem to give license to an enemy to work mischief, but the same philosopher had a remedy at hand, and that was that any man who accused another and failed to prove it by 2 witnesses should suffer the punishment the other would have suffered had he been proven guilty. After the whipping was over, the Roman officer washed his hands, thereby declaring that the actions of the man had produced his own chastisement. Thus, after Pilate had Jesus scourged, he washed his hands forever, clearing the Roman government of the blood of Christ. Now the reader must remember that the soldiers who brought Jesus from the court of the high priest were Jewish soldiers. They were acquainted with the Jewish custom of washing their hands to condemn. Hence, when they saw Pilate wash his hands, they took it for granted Jesus was to die. Now, how can anyone fail to see the beautiful chain of divine providence running through this whole affair? One might say that this would remove the responsibility of the actors in this matter. But if a man undertakes to injure me, and I by my sagacity avert the injury he intended and convert it into a blessing, would that change the guilt of intention by the first party? We also learn from the Mishnah that the Jewish commonwealth was divided into districts, such as Palestine, Galilee, Judea, and so on. Each of these states had its courts and legislators, presided over by a high priest. This is the reason we have so many high priests spoken of in the New Testament history. These states were subdivided into smaller divisions, each of which was presided over by a magistrate who was an officiating priest. If anyone will read the Mishnah, he will see clearly the government of the United States of North America, and as the laws of the Jewish nation were all dictated by the God of heaven, we should appreciate them the more. The Safra means, in the Hebrew language, cornerstone or foundation rock, which goes to show that all these laws were founded upon God's word or authority. This is quite an extended work, and is full of quotations from the various works of the ancient world. The author would have loved to have read this carefully before he had given the extracts to the people. He was sure that this little volume would stir American scholars so that things would be brought before the reading world. But he would advise whoever does it not to trust to the printed copies of the Jewish rabbis, but go as he did to the original manuscript at Byzantium and get it as it was written by its author. One more book the author says must ask attention, he must ask attention to, that is the Sifri. This is more of a chronological and biographical work than anything else, and is by far the most valuable work of them all. It gives the history of the great events of all of them, and mentioning the name of all the actors of those events, giving a detailed account of the births, lineage, deaths, as well as the wise sayings of such men as Abraham, Joshua, Moses, David, Solomon, and many others. The author would have liked to have given many extracts from this work. He wanted to give many extracts on that work. They would be of deep interest to the American people, as well as of great benefit to the young and rising generation. There is one extract he felt he must give. It would be read with great interest by the Independent Order of Odd Fellows in America. Well, if this has been proven to be a fraud, this author would be one of the order of the odd fellows. Okay? Because everyone's saying, oh, this guy's just made a whole lot of rubbish up. He never went to Rome, never went to the Vatican. Okay, he's just making all this stuff up. Very odd fellow. Jacob had 12 sons, and when he saw them there was strife and dissatisfaction among them, he went and got him 12 sticks, and when he had bound them together with strong bands, he gave them to his older son, and asked him to break them. He tried and could not. Then he gave them to the next, and so on until each one down to the youngest had tried to break them. And when they had all failed, the father took the bundle of sticks and untied them. He gave one to the oldest and told him to break it. He did so, and then he gave one to the next, and so on until all the six were broken, and each one had done his part. And Jacob said, now, my sons, you must learn 2 lessons from this. The first lesson is, what neither one of you could do, you all combined can do. And the second lesson is, when you are all bound together, you cannot be broken. Besides all this, there is the Pesikta and Midrashim. These are full of interesting items, sermons and extracts of sermons, and wise sayings of greatest men of all ages. The decisions of the great Sanhedrin on points of law, doctrine, and many other questions of grave importance, and would be of deep interest to the readers of this day. Now, the reader must bear in mind that these several books that have been noticed are all taken from the Talmud of the Sanhedrin, which is made at Jerusalem. These books were compiled by Hillel II, soon after the destruction of the holy city, and were made so that if the scrolls should be destroyed, they might be preserved in these. After these, other translations were made to answer the necessity of the Jews in their dispersed condition, such as the Nagad, Kikhil, Midrash, and so on. But remember, all these works were compiled by the Jewish priests from the original Talmuds, who, of course, would leave out everything that would have a tendency to favour the Christian religion. In all such works, we need not expect to find anything about Jesus of Nazareth. But this by no means proves that such records are not to be found. We must go to the original scrolls, and there we may expect to get the truth, as the following work will go to show. Therefore, let the reader read and see for himself. The author will now ask the reader to go with him and examine and see why it is that none of our ancient historians have made mention of Jesus of Nazareth. Nor of any the circumstances connected with his life. First, the author would notice the history of Josephus. He lived at the time and place where Jesus, John the Baptist, and all the apostles lived. In his 7 historical books entitled The Jewish Wars, he gives an account of the sect called Zealots, who wanted Jesus to go into battle with them as their leader. Jesus spurned them in the offer, telling them that he came to be a peacemaker and not the destroyer of men's lives, that he had saved his life by the sword, that he that saved his life by the sword should lose his life in the life that was to come. He also says that the refusal of Jesus to join the insurrectionists caused a universal detestation of Jesus among the Zealots and Essenes. They thought he had power to kill by the exercise of his will, and his non-resistance was finally the cause of putting him to death, which they did in a most cowardly and brutal manner. Senect 15 and Brute 15, Quintil 3 and 12. In his 20 books on the antiquity and customs of the Jews, he gives biographical sketches of many of the rulers, priests, and kings of that people. He mentions the name of Jesus, making reference to him in more than 50 places, but does not contradict their general history in referring to him. It would be out of the question in a work like this to give the reader the quotations. It would require more space that can be allowed. So the author would give the reference so that anyone can look for himself. Suet in Dom 13, Marshall 9, verse 4. The history of Josephus, as read in this country, is merely an extract translated from the manuscripts originally by Ben Gurion, who was a Jewish rabbi, and then by Haverkamp of Amsterdam in 1726. And this work is the basis of our present translations. And then the author calls the reader's attention to the historian Philo, the greatest of his age. There are over 100 volumes of his writings still in existence. He was a Jew and lived in Alexandria. His first work was The History of Creation, 30 volumes. The second was on sacred history, and his third, The Laws and Customs of the Jews. He commenced his writings about AD 40. They were first translated by Simon, a Jewish rabbi. His works are the most extensive of all others. He often refers to Jesus of Nazareth, but we cannot make reference to them for want of space. In 1742, the works by Simon was translated by Mangate of London, 2 volumes. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote his History of Agricola in AD 56. It was first translated by Marcus, a Jewish rabbi, and so were all the histories written in this age. They were written in the language of those days, and the scribes of those days were most all rabbis. They were the lawyers, doctors, politicians, and statesmen of the day, for they were all students of the Hillel and Shammai schools, which were the most learned bodies of the world. As these were all opposed to Jesus of Nazareth and his followers, of course they kept everything concealed they could that would advance the cause of the Christians. This is the reason why we never had any knowledge of Jesus of Nazareth from the outside world or from his enemies. After making mention of these former things, the question comes up, are these things so? The British Museum has lately acquired, in this time, a grand addition to their library, containing 128 volumes of manuscripts, the writings of great and good men of old. This is enough to start a few inquiries. Who wrote them? When were they written? How were they preserved so long? Some years ago, when the author published a little book entitled ʻtæl, the same questions were started. The reader is referred to the chapter just read for an answer on the subject. The question also comes up, why have not these matters of history been discovered before by our wise men of former ages? In answer to these inquiries, he replies that the wise men such as Dick, Dwight, Watts, Wesley and Clark and all such never made any effort to get hold of such documents. The author then states he defies any man living to show him a man that has made the efforts to obtain such a document with such documents. He defies any man living to show him a man that has made an effort to obtain such a document. They perhaps, like many others, took for granted what the Jewish rabbis said in their histories, that all his records were destroyed, burned up in the great Alexandrian library. Another reason was perhaps this: it may not have been noticed by many that in the year 748 of the Roman Empire and 337 of the Christian era, Constantine III removed the seat of empire from Rome to Byzantium and took with him all the records of the Christians to that city, as will be shown in a letter from him in this book. In regard to having the Holy Scriptures written in manuscript and having 50 volumes bound and kept on deposit, when Muhammad took possession of Constantinople, he had too much respect for these sacred scrolls to let them be destroyed, but had them all nicely cased and deposited in the Saint Sophia Mosque. History informs us of the dreadful struggle that took place between the Greeks and Romans over the sacred parchments in the day of the Crusades, and it seems to me, the author, that divine providence has had something to do in that preservation of these sacred things. These scrolls look more like rolls of narrow carpet wound around a windlass than anything else, but as the author had described them elsewhere, he would not attempt to add a further description here. Another one that comes up in the mind of the reader, and that is, how was it possible for these things to be preserved so long? And the author could answer that there are hundreds of works much older than these in preservation. Homer is 300 years older. Why not these? Another reason why these things have not been brought to the world is no man that he can hear of has made it a special business to investigate these things, as this author had done. After getting hold of ʻtæl, as he did accidentally, he made the investigation of these questions his special business for 10 years, corresponding with many historians and scholars, sending for all the books that could instruct him on these great questions, and then engaging two experts who are fine scholars, Dr. McIntosh of Scotland and Twyman of England. Apparently these two didn't exist, there's no record of them. And going to the city of Rome and paying our way through the Vatican, and then to Constantinople, and then going through those ancient records, thus sparing no time nor expense to acquire a knowledge of these things. Where is another man that has done this? Then it may be asked again, may he not be deceived? May not these men have fooled him? To this he said, that would be impossible. Then it might be argued, might not these things have been counterfeited to make money out of it? To make money of it? If so, if it was a poor man's business, for this is the first and only book ever produced from them, it certainly was a bad speculation on their part. But one says, did not Gregory the IX burn 20 cartloads of these Talmuds? Who says so besides a Jewish rabbi? If he did, they were the Talmuds of Babylon, and not those of Jerusalem. There is no body of Christians stronger adherents to Jesus Christ than the Roman Catholics. Why should they want to burn the Talmuds of Jerusalem, which were so full of the doctrines and historical events that are so near and dear to them? No man can go into the Vatican library without a guard over him, who watch him closely so that he cannot move a leaf or change a word or letter of anything that is in there. If they would not consent to even the slightest change, it is hardly probable they would burn their works. Men from all over the world are there. Often when we crossed the Tiber before, it was fairly light. There were 1,000 strangers between us and St. Peter's Gate, waiting to be admitted, as the opening of the gate that leads into the Vatican. One more evidence to the reader. There are at least 500 quotations made from the Sanhedrin and Talmuds of the Jews by men who have denied their existence. Now, the author calls your attention to history and would give you the name, page and all so you can read for yourself. First, Rabbi Akiba, a Reformed Jewish priest, volume 1, page 22, quotes from the Celsus, an enemy of the church. He says there was a dreadful earthquake at the time when Jesus was crucified, and that the mists that arose from it covered the earth for 3 hours. On page 28, he says that Jesus was the son of Mary, that he was the founder of the sect called Christians. On page 48, he says that Jesus was crucified on the eve of the Passover. He gives extracts from the apostles and never denies in a single instance, but admits their genuineness. He quotes the books and makes extracts from the names they bear. He makes particular notice of his incarnation, of his being born of a virgin, of his being worshipped by the Magi, of his flight into Egypt, of the slaughter of the infants at Bethlehem. On page 52, he speaks of his baptism by John and the descent of the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, and of the voice that was heard out of heaven. He speaks of the miracles done by Jesus and never doubts the facts in any instance, but attributes them to the art of necromancy he had learned in Egypt. Apparently Jesus had learned in Egypt. But did the reader ever hear of a thaumaturgist producing the descent of the Holy Spirit, or causing voices to speak from the heavens? Such absurdities are not heard of except when they are against the Christian religion. Aretas, one of the kings of Arabia, who was a philosopher as well as a king, in speaking of the laws of nature, volume 7, page 14, says that Jesus of Judea was a philosopher above the laws of nature, that he controlled all the elements of nature with almighty power, that the winds, thunders and lightnings obeyed him, and speaks of these facts as being so common that it would be folly to dispute them. Justin says in volume 2, page 42, that the various governors of Rome in their several provinces made reports of the important events that occurred in their jurisdiction, and they were spread on the senatorial dockets at Rome. We find in the same work, page 128, that he appealed to Antoninus and the Senate for clemency for the Christians, and after referring to their many virtues and to Christ as their leader, added, and that these things are so, I refer you to the records of the Senate made by Pontius Pilate and others in his day. The learned Tertullian, in his apology for Christianity, about the year 200, after speaking of our Saviour's crucifixion and resurrection, and his appearance to the disciples, and ascension into heaven in the sight of the same disciples, who were ordained by him to publish the gospel over the world, to spread the good news. Thus proceeds. Of all these things relating to Christ, Pilate himself in his conscience already a Christian, because what's, this man Christ is innocent, I had a dream, etc., etc. The same writer in the same apology thus relates the proceedings of Tiberius on receiving this information. There was an ancient decree that no one should be received for a deity unless he was first approved by the Senate. Yeah, we read about that. The Romans had to approve this person being a god, little g, or a god with a big G. It was up until then, until they decided and declared, or by the decree said, yeah, that guy's a god. So it had to be approved by the Senate, because the Senate were the ones saying to all the Caesars, Constantine, etc. Or you got to go around saying that you are. We've got a decree. We've got a decree which says you are divine. You are the son of Jupiter, etc. People have to act as though you're a god. You have to remind them that you are a god, etc., etc. There was an ancient decree that no one should be received for a deity unless he was first approved by the Senate. Tiberius, in whose time the Christian name or religion had its rise, having received from Palestine and Syria an account of such things as manifested the truth of his Christ's divinity, proposed by the Senate that he should be enrolled among the Roman gods, and gave his own prerogative vote in favour of the motion. But the Senate, without whose consent no deification could take place, rejected it because the emperor himself had declined the same honour. You see, no, I'm not going to take on that god status, that title, because I'm not a god. I'm like everybody else outside. I'm a freaking human. Nevertheless, the emperor persisted in his opinion, and threatened punishment to the accusers of the Christians. Search your own commentaries or public writings. You will there find that Nero was the first who raged with the imperial sword against the sect then rising most at Rome. Horn's Introduction, Volume 1, page 82. Now the author would ask, if there were no such records there, would these men have made such appeals? And if they were there, could such things have been forged and palmed off on the Roman Senate? It seems to the author that to ask the question is enough. And now we've got chapter 2, Dr. Rubin's letter, Dr. McIntosh's letter to the people of America, Reverend W.D. Mahan's letter from Rome to his family, and then Dr. McIntosh's letter, Constantinople, Turkey, October 16, 1883. This person's, Mahan's peers, said that there's no record of a Dr. Reuben, McIntosh, or anybody else that Mahan came up with. There's no evidence of these people existing. And in W.D. Mahan's letter, Market Platt, City of Rome, Italy. Dear wife, it seems long since I left home, but God is here as well as in America, and it is my chief delight to report you and the children to his throne of mercy daily. I was landed at Marseilles, France, after 12 days out from New York, and so forth. The second day I began to cast up my accounts, not with my makeup nor my creditors, but with my stomach. I was awful sick, and so forth. He makes these bold claims that he went into the Vatican. Today was the day of the Pope's holy auditory. We were taken in by our guard, and the author confessed he never had such feelings in all his life. The room, he supposed, was 300 feet square or more. There must have been 10 or 1200 in the congregation, all men, mostly priests and officers. The Pope is a plain, venerable old man. He saw nothing different in his dress to any other priest, nothing gaudy about him. He cried Mass in the pure old Latin language. His voice was clear and sweet. After he was through, quite a number of the priests came and knelt at his feet. He laid his hands gently on each of their heads and pronounced a blessing, but they did not kiss his great toe. The author never saw a solemner congregation in his life. In fact, it would be impossible for a man to be otherwise in that room. Of all the painting his eyes ever beheld, there were 100 glass eyes with golden lids and lashes, all uniting their various colours of light, and all seemed to be so natural. He almost thought he could see them winking, this one to represent the all-seeing eye. These eyes are the light of the room, but the scene of magnificence beggars description. There are too many things to be described, but a man will have a higher appreciation of the Catholic Church when he sees her enthroned in the hearts of this great church. And shall ever, and this author would ever have a different feeling towards him to what he had. They had all the textbooks they needed, Buxtorf, Geslind, Laportes and others. They'd get through the Vatican in a few days. They would leave Dr. Timon and 3 clerks there and find the Hillite letters and the Shemite and Abtalian laws in book form. They will translate such parts of them as we want and send them to him, to the author, etc., etc. And he states he'll be home by the 10th or 15th of December, and he'll write no more unless something happens. W.D. Mahan. Chapter 3, Eusebius' History of the Roman Emperors, Constantine and Constantine's letters in regard to having 50 copies of the scriptures written and found. He's a pretty good story spinner if he is proven a fraud. Jonathan's interview with the Bethlehem shepherds, letters of Malcha, priest of the synagogue at Bethlehem, Sanhedrin 88 by R. Jose, order number 2. He'll be a great storyteller if it's a complete fraud or forgery as claimed by his peers. We hope that you found it interesting, an eye-opener, even though it's supposedly a forgery. It's fraudulent, and what Mahan claimed was false. He never made it to the Vatican or Turkey or anywhere else. If you like this video, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, the Ministry of the Real Truth, and then go share this with all your friends and family, just so they're aware that there's a lot of claims out there, a lot of this and a lot of that, and a lot of it's phooey. You've got to do the research to find out if they're for real or a complete load of baloney by going and looking at or doing some investigative journalism and go look around for the pros and the cons of these different people making their claims as fact, saying that they're fact, the evidence that they have or proofs is evident, etc., when they possibly aren't, and so forth, because of late there's a lot of shenanigans going on, right? People getting caught for grooming, molestation within the church, today's modern church. So you have to be very, very careful. You have to know what you're reading and what you're being told by your church leaders. You have to discern, have some discernment, and you go do the research, and instead of just blurping off a whole lot of scriptures that you've basically learnt by rote, you've been told at your church, this is what it says, this is what it means, listen to us, we know what we're talking about because we're the chosen of God, etc., etc. When often in reality they've given you a false translation or transliteration or interpretation of those scriptures, and then they're asking you for your money in many different ways. Plant a seed, reap a harvest. If you love Israel, give us all your money, and so forth. You have to have some discernment And you have to go and do your research, etc., etc. And establish the facts, the claim facts as facts. Find that evidence that proves itself evident. Look at these different people, these writers, these authors, especially from days of old to modern times, to verify if they're infallible. Then that's in order to, once you have found them irrefutable and infallible, or their writings, those people irrefutable, infallible, then that should at some point deem their writings irrefutable, infallible. They'll always be debunked, no matter how much evidence you bring. Someone will always come up with some theory, evidence, or just come out and say, oh nah, just for the hell of it. Be very wary, stay alert, do your research, provide your sources, links to your sources to back up everything that you say, or else it's just hearsay.